I agree this information does come from the book Indians in London, which is this,
There
in
you go.
case any of you was wondering,
Yeah.
from the birth of the East India Company to independent India.
Yeah.
And what Shurju has already touched on is the birth of the East India Company, which he sort of condensed to the year 1600. So in September 1600 is when the East India Company was born, so to speak, and 1947 is when India was reborn, for lack of a better word. So roughly that is uh, the framework, the historical framework of Indians in London. But I'd like to answer one of the questions that Shurju asked first before I go into the data and the detail. So what really inspired me to write this history, and why can this history be called an alternative history or an alternative book to the histories that we've read so far, is answerable through an experiment which I learned from Alan Watts, who has got no connection whatsoever with this book,
Okay.
with history. He was a spiritualist, for lack of a better word. He popularized things like Taoism and Buddhism and Vedanta
Okay.
in America, and he was a Briton, an Englishman. So he gives the example, and this is given to many students in engineering courses, in courses of neuroscience, whenever we are teaching logic, methodologies, etc. That if we imagine a bird flying on a blank screen, or a sky which has no line practically, which is a blank canvas, then you wouldn't have any coordinates to measure the velocity or the trajectory or the momentum, any of those vectors that the bird carries with itself. But the moment you plant a tree into the scene, you have some coordinates and you have a locus to compare the left and right, or the north and south, as it were. So we have been taught history as a very dull discipline in school, and this is the view of many people I have spoken to, and I'll give their reasons why I'm calling it dull. Dull is not my word, really. But one of the reasons for this dullness is that history was taught as a discipline where imaginative elements do not matter, where poetry is more or less censored, and it is certainly different than fiction. So the kind of compartmentalization that has happened in our schools, and not just Indian schools, but schools worldwide, is that history and literature definitely do not coincide, and all those methods and empirical tools are meant for the physics and chemistry laboratories and so on, and never shall the twain meet. So these are the fundamental confusions which have been planted into the souls of our innocent countrymen and global citizens, as it were. So the first challenge for me was to unshackle myself from the arbitrary tree that had been planted for me, and to plant a new one. And there was no embarrassment, no shame, and no qualm whatsoever for me to accept and acknowledge that London is as much an extension of India as, let's say, the Ram Setu, Dhanushkodi Islands, and the Rameshwaram Island is. And I'll tell you my reasons for that. And here is where it might get a little scholarly, but people with an understanding of non-locality, of quantum entanglement, will understand it very easily. People who have some idea about concepts like non-duality or non-dualism will also understand it very easily. And people who read history will also understand it extremely easily. So what happens around 1550s, and this is as far back as we can recognize, we can certainly hunt further back, but this book more or less begins in 1550s, at the time when Shakespeare was about to be born, and the time when Shakespeare was writing, and the time when he dies. He dies in 1616, which is also the year that is today recognizable as the year of the first Indian baptism in London, that of Peter Pope. And Peter Pope is baptized in East London in a place called Aldgate, Fenchurch Street, which is now no longer the church which it used to be in 1616 because it was burned down in 1666. So Peter Pope is the first recognizable name of an Indian origin who gets baptized in London. 1616 is, like I said, also the year when Shakespeare dies. So it is the end of an era. In school or in college, this era is more or less referred to as the Elizabethan era. And then a new era takes over. And this will immediately be followed by, in 10 or 20 years, the English Civil War, and King Charles I will be beheaded, and King Charles II will be in exile, and he'll return and re-establish the monarchy in 1660. So this phase is so hectic with commercial, political, and social and religious developments in English history, that the history of immigrations, not just from India, but from the Caribbean islands, from Eastern Europe, from Southern America, Latin America, and Africa, have been completely whitewashed, literally whitewashed, because they've been sort of imbibed seamlessly into the quote unquote white history, as it were, which is why we've got scandals like the Windrush scandal and Brexit in the 21st century. And people think that Britain should be for the British, meaning it should be for the whites, but it's anything but white in the time that my book begins. And I don't focus on Britain, however, because I'm particularly interested in London. I'm not talking about Britain because I mentioned a key and probably a very, very controversial point, that London is an extension of India. And I mentioned three distinct branches of people who'd be able to relate to this. And now I'll explain how it is an extension of India. In 1666, London is mutilated by the Great Fire. It spreads from Pudding Lane, which is not very far from where Peter Pope was baptized 50 years ago. And it demolishes whatever we today recognize as central London. Now, I know for a fact that not all our listeners will be privy to the geography of London, and not all our listeners will be admirers of Bertie Wooster or Sherlock Holmes or Downton Abbey and so on and so on. But roughly a sketch has been drawn up in our minds by the likes of Arthur Conan Doyle, Charles Dickens, and all the Victorian authors that willingly, knowingly, unknowingly, lovingly, hatefully, we learn in school, and some of us go on to have a very, very emotional relationship with that city, whether or not we have actually visited it, whether or not we actually want to visit that place. So this is, the city gets hammered into our imagination since school, and there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But the reason why this happens is because of an unacknowledged debt that London owes to India. So in 1666, after the fire mutilates London, London and its churches, that is central London of today, are rebuilt by Christopher Wren and company. And this rebuilding reaches the beginning of its end by early 18th century, but it continues to be rebuilt. And the cost of rebuilding London after the fire in today's value is estimated to be 37 billion pounds. This is significant because by the end of 1813, when the East India Company lost its monopoly to trade in India with China and its neighbors, the audit reports show that the estimated value of its assets in Greater India were something around 300 billion pounds, which is, I think, close to 8 times the number that was required to rebuild London. So am I suggesting that London was rebuilt by Indian money? I am definitely not suggesting that London was not rebuilt by Indian money, but it is not one and the same thing, because there's a big difference. So how it happened is something like this. After 1667, a coal tax was initiated in Britain, so that whatever coal that was coming to London was to fetch a lot of revenue for the subsequent British governments. And
hate to jump in.
yeah,
You can obviously you will continue there,
yeah,
but you bring up such an interesting point, right? 37 billion pounds to rebuild, the cost of
mm,
rebuilding by Christopher Wren and Company post the Great
mm,
Fire of London in 1666. All right. In 1813, the audits show that 300 billion pounds is what the East India Company's assets in Greater India more or
mm.
less wind up to be.
I'll just interrupt you just for the sake of proportion, Shurja.
Yeah.
We are trying to build what we call, or what our state calls, a $3 trillion economy today.
Yes.
That is after the railways, after the airways, after the internet.
Yeah.
In 1813, we did not have the internet, definitely not the airways, and even the railways were about to be born.
Yeah.
So this is prior to these three, extraordinary world-changing technologies. So 300 billion pounds back then is an enormous sum of money.
Yeah.
If 37 billion pounds is huge, this is enormous multiplied by many enormouses.